if the only thing you cared about was growth, would you park your money in defence? I think the answer is probably no, honestly. Because if that were true, we could have been doing it 10 years ago. So I think there are other things you could have done with that money. I think the danger is thinking that there's no trade-off, that you can have higher defence spending, higher growth, higher security, and you get one thing with no trade-offs. I don't think that's true. I think there are trade-offs. That money could have been reallocated to higher, science innovation spending in general, not just in the military. Hello, and welcome to the IFS Zooms In. I'm Helen Miller, Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies. To mark the one-year anniversary of Keir Starmer's Labour government and my first week as Director of the IFS, we held a joint event with the Institute for Government. We looked at the government's missions and how they've performed. So for today's episode, we're excited to share that discussion with you. There's obviously lots of focus at the moment on the big picture public finances and whether the Chancellor will raise taxes in autumn in order to stick to her fiscal rules. But it's worth remembering that on coming to power, the government argued that a new, mission-driven approach to governing was needed. And, I'm going to quote, they wanted to raise our sights as a nation and focus on the long-term objectives. They set out 5 overarching missions, stating pretty clearly that economic growth was their number one mission. So I think it's important to remember that we shouldn't judge the government merely on whether and how they meet their fiscal rules, but more broadly on what they achieve, including on whether they can credibly expect to achieve their long-run ambitions. So I don't want to give you too many spoilers, but what struck me from the discussion is that while there are some clear examples of policies aimed at achieving missions, so things like investing more in science or innovation or reforming planning rules, there's actually very little evidence that there's a new way of governing, a new way of doing things. And if you think about the growth mission, it's not entirely clear that it is still the top priority, but it's also the case that the government could do more. And in my mind, taking tax reform off the table has been a big missed opportunity. So for this discussion, I was joined by Stephen Bush from the Financial Times and Gemma Tetlow from the Institute for Government. Hannah White, the director of the IFG, chaired the discussion. I hope you enjoy it.
The concept of missions was a strong guiding principle for the Labour government when they were in opposition. They unveiled their plans to have a mission-led government back in February 23, and Keir Starmer said at the time this was about long-term decision-making, not the short-termism that will only ever provide the sticking plaster. So, how much have this government's decisions, trade-offs and policy priorities been shaped by its 5 missions? And how far has the government been able to make progress on these priorities in its first year? We have a fantastic panel here today to discuss these questions and more. We'll be taking questions from the audience here in the room. And if you are watching on online, please use the Slido button to send us your questions so they will come seamlessly onto this iPad in front of me, and I will start to weave those into our conversation. Our panel comprises, on my left, Stephen Bush, Associate Editor and Columnist at the Financial Times. On my right, Helen Miller, Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies. And on my far right, Gemma Tetlow, our Chief Economist here at the IFG. So we are going to kick off, and as I say, we will come to questions as we progress through. And really, Stephen, I wanted to start with you to give us the high-level picture. What would you pick out as this government's key achievements and key missteps in the year they've had in government so far?
Well, I'll start with the difficult bit of that question first, which is the achievements end of the ledger. So the government has had some pretty big achievements in foreign policy, not least, it's a co-achievement, but not least this morning, Donald Trump saying that he will provide further arms to Ukraine, which a thing that lots of people in my profession, myself included, very much have started to do is go, oh yeah, well, he's okay on the global stage, I guess, before moving on to the litany of domestic complaints. But actually, the global stage stuff is really important. So we should, before I go, I guess, we should mark that is a significant set of achievements. The other, I think, thing on the positive side of the ledger, in addition to planning reform, is the forgotten changes to Rachel Reeves' fiscal rules, which, I mean, ironically, because you talk to a Labour MP, you talk to a cabinet minister, and they believe that they have the world's most tight and rigid set of spending rules, but they've actually got considerably looser. The positive thing about that is that historically governments of all shades, when the going has got tough, have cut infrastructure spending because it's politically easier. I think that the shift to a rule which means that you can't do that because it doesn't create money, well, the ridiculousness of all of our fiscal rules is, and we talk about creating headroom, but it's headroom against, debt. It's like saying I have headroom against the card that Barclays keeps extending the limit on when I forget to tell them not to. It's not really how it works. But those are positive changes. Obviously, the negative side of the ledger is quite a bit bigger, almost all of which I think actually can be traced back to decisions made at the same time as that decision in opposition to be a mission-led government, self-denying ordinances on tax. The fact that I think, without spiking the ball too early, I think right from the beginning those missions didn't seem to have any impact on the promises they made on tax and spending. They didn't really seem to winnow down what they were willing to defend and retreat from in opposition, and they haven't had a particular impact in government either.
Well, we can finish the event there then. Gemma, just going back to that quote I used at the start from Keir Starmer about long-termism, would you say that this government there is any evidence that they are taking a longer-term approach?
I think in lots of ways, yes, I think there is. And in some ways, they're choices that are not necessarily generating short-term political wins for this government. So as Stephen said, part of their fiscal rules change was to separate out borrowing that can be done for day-to-day spending and borrowing that can be done for investment, ring-fencing the latter, and that does mean that capital budget has been more protected than it has been in the past when governments have needed to find cuts. So we've got more capital spending, which is a long-term decision. It's fixing some of the problems in public services and lack of infrastructure in the UK, which will pay off in the long term, not in this Parliament. Going alongside that, there's a 10-year infrastructure strategy, which also gives a much clearer sense of what do we need and how are we going to deliver that. We've now got a 10-year NHS plan, which perhaps isn't as strong as it could have been, but it is an attempt to think about that longer term picture. And the industrial strategy is also more of a overarching look at the UK economy, thinking about how we position for the future. So I think in lots of those areas, there is a lot of longer term thinking here than we've had in recent years. I guess the one big thing, and we'll probably come back to talk about this more, but I think looking in the round, I don't have a sense that this government has grappled with the big long-term fiscal question and how do we actually get the UK onto a sustainable fiscal path, which the OBR's Fiscal Risks and Sustainability report last week set out, looks pretty worrying. And I think that sort of big long-term question the government has not yet grappled with.
That's a very nice segue to ask Helen. I mean, in opposition, Labour took the choice that they were going to mirror the Conservatives' statements that they weren't going to increase taxes. It always, although they obviously notionally costed everything in their manifesto, the implication of the change that they were going to be able to bring about in government was obviously sort of bigger. How have they handled that since coming to power? We obviously had the immediate sort of cries of horror when they opened the account books and discovered things that were fairly self-evident to both you and Gemma, who'd been talking about them quite a lot on into the election.
Yeah. Yeah, but I think you're right. I think it is worth winding back to that kind of pre-election period, because I think a lot of the mistakes were kind of made there because Gemma and I and others were saying that whatever government came into power, they were going to need to do some combination of increase taxes, cut spending, or increase borrowing. And that's before you think about anything to missions. That's just kind of like the underlying public finance situation. And no politician really, very few politicians wanted to speak about that or be upfront about that. And that's, again, before you think about the missions. And money isn't everything with the missions. I think it's worth remembering that. But you need actually lots of good detailed policy. But if you look at the scale of the ambition on some of those things, money was obviously always going to be part of it. But we didn't really have a conversation pre-election about what that looked like. So then, Labour come into power, they have this Bring Out the Bodies event where you say, oh, we found a black hole. Then you have the kind of one and done budget, like we found a black hole, we fixed the black hole. And I think the kind of image was that, well, we're done now. We've sort of found the problem, we've fixed the problem. But that was always far too narrow because it ignored the massive set of risks that were coming down the road. It didn't really in some ways it was impressive because they loosened the fiscal rules, lots more investment, but it didn't really make room, not just for more spending potentially, but it didn't make room for, I think, that broader debate about we need to reform things, we need to be bold on put anything in that list. I think without having that vision for there's a big set of challenges here, we need a big vision of where we want to get to, and we should expect to be doing lots of big reforms. None of that pitch rolling was done. So instead we're going from fiscal event to fiscal event, just trying to just trying to do this credit card thing, just trying to get our little headroom down. I think so. The mistake was, I think, to start far too narrow and to not make the space for the big debates about what a mission would really look like, where could we really get to, and how would we get there?
Missions could have been that, right? Missions could have been a way to create a vision and to justify and to articulate why you needed to do some of those big reforming decisions and to do them early on. Do you think they were ever intended to be that, or do you think they were just a sort of organising principle and a slogan which seemed neat and a way to summarise a few priorities in opposition?
I think at a very early stage, before they actually had specific missions, the idea of having mission-led government is something that does appeal to Keir Starmer to the extent he has an ideology. Because the weird thing about Keir Starmer, right, is he's a politician who doesn't have an ideology, but he does more than basically anyone who's been prime minister for the first time ever have an institutional theory, right? In a way than really only Harold Wilson the second time or Winston Churchill the second time, where also admittedly Winston Churchill the second time was also about managing his infirmity. He does have a theory of how you run organizations. So missions as a kind of big picture, I have a theory about how organizations drive change, and it is headline missions did have a purpose. But the second they had any coherence on them, and I'm not going to make us all try and remember what they are because I think that would be a good way to embarrass all of us. But they are all driven by electoral imperatives of some kind or another, right? They are not, if you were to do a list of the big 6 missions you thought the government needed to turn around to get the state in a better position, the public finances in a better position, they are not the ones you would draw up. But if you were to go, I wonder what would be nice to put on a nice British flag themed leaflet with the word Labour on it in the summer of 2024, you would go, you'd need something on the police, something defensive on boats, something defensive on growth so that we have an argument on tax, something on NHS because that's our home issue, et cetera, et cetera. And so they were never really, I think, intended to be useful tools to take people along a journey on radical change or to burst through ministerial silos, which is part of why they almost immediately in government were then replaced by the milestones.
Yeah, I think we thought that the missions were always going to be too high level. You're always going to need something to articulate between the micro level of a manifesto and the very macro level of a missions, the stuff that you're actually going to get done in pursuit of that mission along the way. But Helen, do you think it has played out that way? To what extent can you see the missions having shaped the decisions and the priorities of the government?
So I think it's worth saying that whether you call it a mission or something else, I think having some long-run sense of where you want to be is a very good idea. I'm always amazed that projects don't have more of that. If you don't know where you're going, how the hell are you going to plot how to get there? So I think that we want to get somewhere, and I think, as I agree with Gemma, the longer run, like knowing that the long run matters, you have to be a bit more, less short-termist than 3 or 4 years. I think that's a good idea in principle, and I agree with Gemma. I think you do see bits of that in some bits of policy, like the big increase in investment, the longer run plan, the infrastructure plan. I think you see glimpses of that in places. Maybe we'll come back to what they spent the money on the spending review. Some of the big increases in investment on, net zero, you sort of see it a bit there. But I think it's 2 things. One is it doesn't feel like a radical change, right? I think growth should be the number 1 mission. I think we should be throwing the kitchen sink at it. It doesn't feel to me like this is a driving through everything. Everyone's trying to work out how do you get up growth. We're all trying to push in the same direction. It feels like we're doing some things on the plus side, we're doing some things on the negative side. It doesn't feel like a really driving force. And I think another thing that's changed over the year is that defence has become a priority in a way that it wasn't going into the election. So if you look at the spending review numbers, what really stood out to me on that was just how much money we're putting into the capital budget for defence. And maybe we'll come back to whether that's good for growth or not, but that seems to me like that's sort of overtaken some other priorities. And obviously things change, but that wasn't the big thing that we were talking about a year ago.
Can we go straight on to that question about the relationship between defence investment and economic growth? Because Keir Starmer has implied that is a connection that we should be seeing. But do you think that this increase in defence spending, which obviously was not anticipated ahead of the election, the geopolitics has changed, and that's very much a sort of understandable thing, but do you think it is going to contribute to growth in the way that he suggests?
So I think that some part of that spending could contribute to growth. If you're thinking about, I guess the best case scenario is that you put some more money into new military-related technology, so you do some R&D and that has some positive benefits, and maybe the world's going to be doing more defence and you design some things that you can sell to the rest of the world, that there could be some growth there. simply buying, more ammunition is not going to be pro-growth. That's just parking your money in bullets. And I think stepping back from I think in some sense, whether it's pro-growth or not is sort of the wrong question. I think it's if the only thing you cared about was growth, would you park your money in defence? I think the answer is probably no, honestly. Because if that were true, we could have been doing it 10 years ago. So I think, there are other things you could have done with that money. I think the danger is thinking that there's no trade-off, that you can have higher defence spending, higher growth, higher security, and you get one thing with no trade-offs. I don't think that's true. I think there are trade-offs. That money could have been reallocated to higher, science innovation spending in general, not just in the military. It could have been put into more infrastructure spending, the transport budget's getting cut on the capital side. We could have put more money into transport. So yes, I think it might have some growth effects, but I don't think we should see it primarily as a growth policy. It's a defence policy, which is not a bad thing necessarily, but we shouldn't think there aren't trade-offs, is my view.
Yeah, but maybe if we feel we have to spend the money on defence, at least it won't have no.
Sure, if you're going to do it, then do it in the best growth way possible. Yeah, which
Yeah.
I think basically means get as much of it as you can towards R&D. Will be one way to do that.
Gemma, Helen started there talking about the way in which the spending review, how we should interpret the spending review for what it means we should take away from it for what we should understand to be the government's priorities. Have you got any other thoughts on that?
I mean, it was definitely noticeable in the spending review speech that instead of the 5 missions, Rachel Reeves talked about health, security and growth. So a lot of the existing 5 missions got bundled together in that security bucket in the middle. And I think probably the 2 missions that we've heard least about over the course of the year are the opportunities and safer streets missions. It's not to say they were completely absent from the spending review. I think within the Home Office budget, there was an attempt to protect the police budget and to be more ambitious or heroic in cutting back on things like asylum spending. But there's definitely been a shift, and partly that's driven by the rising importance of defence. So money has inevitably had to go there, which might have gone to somewhere else. But I think we did see in the spending review some slight shifting of priorities. And some of that is still going to the mission, so that DESNE's budget for net zero did reasonably well, suggesting that net zero continues to be a priority for them. Within growth, I mean, looking at the capital budget allocations, it's sort of somewhat growth friendly. There's a reasonable amount went to the business and trade department, which was then followed up with the industrial strategy. So I think the spending review overall did suggest a slight shift in prioritisation away from the original 5 missions.
Stephen, Helen said she thinks, the growth should be the overriding absolute focus of the government. Do you agree with that? But crucially, do you think that voters will see the logic of that?
I mean, I agree. I don't think voters do see the logic of it in the abstract, but I don't think anyone in 1955, 1983, 87, 2001, or 2005, when I'm voting for the importance of growth. But if we actually think about why it is people went, oh, well, yeah, there is unemployment, or, oh, yeah, I am angry about the Iraq, or I do think ITV is too garish, or whatever. The reason why people were re-electing those governments in this was growth, right? I think one of the problems the government has is that because there isn't by design, there is no big political project coming from the principal, all organizations are happiest when they can work to the boss, whether they're large or they're small. And when the boss doesn't set a direction, the direction then becomes, the polls and the voters. But because none of us go, yeah, I really love growth, we just love the fact that it happens, you do end up with this government chasing its own tail where growth is nominally one of its missions, provided that growth doesn't involve businesses doing anything unpopular, a relationship that's close enough to the EU that anyone who voted Labour or for Leave at any point in the last 20 years might get upset, or it might involve any more immigrants anywhere other than, city centres, and then you don't really have a commitment to growth.
Mm. And just to go back to the defence point, what do you think the public think about defence spending?
I think people obviously grasp that there is a war in Europe right now, which is our business. We continue to be a fascinating outlier, actually, in European politics in terms of the depth and level of support for the Ukraine cause. I mean, that is if you were thinking of reasons to be short Farage, that is, I think, probably still his biggest vulnerability, is that when the point of, just as it was a problem for Corbyn, that when the point of decision comes, people going like, actually, are you a bit anti-West, is a vulnerability he has. But ultimately we've got an excellent 100-year experiment of Barrow and Cambridge about whether or not defence spending or research spending is better for driving growth. And with the greatest of respect, they're two marginal constituencies I've spent a lot of time at in my career. I think I'm going to give it to Cambridge on the growth story. And I think one of the reasons why people are having a slightly allergic reaction to this government at the moment is I think the average person does grasp the idea that defence is part of the growth mission is a bit of a fairy story, and they grasp that actually the clean energy stuff is also a bit of those are both essential things, and if you don't do them, you will bear bigger costs later on, and the fiscal picture gets even worse, etc., etc. But the problem is that the Labour Party has a kind of now eat your green story about defence and clean energy spending, which is believed by no one but itself. And the fact it believes it means that it can avoid having the tough conversations with itself about what actually gets growth, because they clearly have at some level subscribed to the idea that what will get them out of those very sharp implied cuts in 27A is that defence spending will fix everything, which it obviously won't.
Helen, do you think there are very obvious missed opportunities that either within the spending review or elsewhere the government has missed when it comes to boosting growth?
Yeah, so I think one thing I think they really have missed this opportunity to paint a picture of what we're talking about. I absolutely agree with Stephen. You don't go and tell the public we need growth. I mean, that's far too abstract. You can talk about needing better infrastructure, practical things like potholes, being able to get the train to work, being able to get your kids to school without having to sit in traffic for 45 minutes, being able to move. You can talk about things that are living standards, wages, very tangible, people really care about that stuff. I think you can talk about those things in a way that doesn't feel very abstract. I think they've missed that opportunity to say, here's the vision, here's the sunny uplands, what we're trying to achieve. On the spending review, obviously spending's not the only way the government can do growth. In fact, we shouldn't think that it's just a spending problem. I mean, actually, spending means more taxes. There are two sides to that. But again, there are trade-offs. The government could have put less into defence and more into transport and general science. So that's a choice, but there are trade-offs there. It's not everything. The big thing for me that I think has been taken off the table is tax reform. And I think we were saying before the election that's a massive mistake, because even if you don't want to raise taxes, you could be a really, adamant again, you don't know what's going to come. Why take these amazing policy tools off the table before you know what's going to come? Also, even if you want to keep tax revenues the same or even lower, you can just list every tax, and there's a huge problem with every tax. And there's massive ways in which taxes are holding back growth. You should be reforming them. And so I think taking they raised something like, £1,100 billion through tax revenues. We could do that better. I think taking that off the table was a massive mistake. And it's going to make it hard in the budget, not just because of how do you get the money right into the tax locks, which I'm sort of getting a bit bored of, honestly, as a question. It's you've made it hard because there are all these things you could do that would have a really pro-growth, pro-reform, spending story that you've just cut off. I think that's been a big mistake.
Why do you think the government hasn't done that? It's just too difficult? They want to focus on other policy priorities, or what's your take?
Why they haven't a big tax reform?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, they're clearly not the first government to not do big tax reform.
That is why we are where we are.
I think the big problems with tax reform are there are always going to be losers, and the losers tend to be more concentrated and the winners are quite diffuse. But actually, I think potentially that's where doing something bigger and more radical is sometimes easier than doing small things, because we've seen with this government doing small things that you do a tweak to agricultural property relief in inheritance tax, and it's very obvious who loses from that, and they come out and they campaign against it.
And they drive their tractors through town.
Yes. If you did something much more radical, I think Martin Sambu was suggesting today we merge income tax and national insurance together. So it is somewhat obvious that that's going to impose a higher tax rate on unearned income, but you'd have a lower tax rate on earned income, and you can tell a good story about why that is making the tax system simpler. It's improving incentives to work as opposed to generating income from investments. You could tell a bigger story around those kind of things. And if you package lots of things together, then you can end up with a situation where people are winning from one, losing from the other, not quite sure what's happening around the margins. I think the other reason governments don't go for tax reform, frankly, is that the number of people who really understand the tax system and the problems it causes are quite a small number of people. Most of the people who understand the tax system in detail are probably the ones who are making use of the existing loopholes and incentives and things within it. It's not the man on the street who doesn't really understand why that complex mishmash of policies at the moment is disincentivizing or distorting economic activity in a way that's bad for the economy as a whole. So I think that just all makes it quite a difficult thing to do.
And you've argued in the past that actually, it's one with tax reform, it's one of these examples of a thing where you shouldn't let a good crisis go to waste. I mean, again, that is a bit of a issue why the government could have come in and done something early based on saying, they'd made the argument around the black hole that might have been an opportunity to do something more radical.
Yes, exactly. I think unfortunately in the COVID crisis, we saw a period where Rishi Sunak floated some ideas about reforming the tax system. So particularly he said, we've really helped self-employed people. There may be a payback asked for this, and we may want to more equalise the tax treatment of employees and self-employed. And then that kind of died by the wayside as time went on and it became less imperative. Yes, I think you could, this government seems to puts a lot of store on stability, and that in its tax strategy has translated into saying, we will not change X, Y, Z tax rates, rather than I think you could have had a different version of stability within tax, which said, this is our vision of what a good tax system for the UK looks like, and this is where we're heading, which might have meant some changes, but has a sense of what the government really thinks is the priority for the tax system.
Yeah, I actually very strongly with that. I mean, I think what we want is predictability rather than stability per se. I think you've got a rubbish system. You don't stick to it just because it's stable. I think you say, here's what we're going to do that's better and here's how we get to it. And I sort of agree. I agree with Gemma's sort of analysis of why it's difficult. But I don't think people are stupid. I think you can explain things to them about why certain, people, stamp duty is a good example. People know that stamp duty is a bad tax. I think you can explain things in a way that people understand, and you can also tell them about what would be better about the new system, not just the winners and losers, but what would be better in the broader economic environment. So I think we shouldn't be sort of fatalistic about, it's hard, so we can't do it. I mean, we put a man on the moon, we could reform our tax system, right? So I think we should really think big. It's also worth saying that if you can't make it better, you can at least not make it worse. So things like you cannot increase stamp duty, you cannot increase the difference between workers and self-employed. I mean, there's a real danger that we sort of go in the opposite direction because of these. We've tied our hands, or the government's tied its hands on choices. Not only do you not get good reforms, you actually get tinkering that make it worse and make it harder. And I think that's a real danger for the budget, actually.
And the more tinkering, the easier it is for people to find their loopholes. Tempting as it is to spend the whole event talking about tax reform, we'll move on to the NHS. Helen, the NHS got a relatively generous settlement, as was expected, not quite as generous as it has received at some points in the past. Do you think it will be enough to achieve the sorts of waiting list targets and transformation of services that we've seen in the 10-year plan?
Yeah, so there's a few things on that. So they did get a more generous settlement. In that sense, the government was sort of following through on its priorities. And like Stephen said, it's something that people really care about. There's kind of a broader health, which is really an NHS mission. And they've got this specific milestone around getting the waiting times for elective treatments down. On the one hand, you could look at that and say it's not very ambitious at all. We're looking at trying to get back to where we were in the 2010s. And that would be good, but is that all we're really going to do? If we achieve that, there'd still be waiting lists for A&E, for GPs. There'd be a broader set of services that I think voters would still be thinking, hang on, this feels a bit rubbish. On the other hand, it's actually a really ambitious target. You're trying to undo like a decade of declining these waiting lists in a parliament. So I think despite them getting a more generous settlement, actually, could they achieve that particular milestone? Yes, I don't think it's likely, but they could. But even if they did, there's a broader set of things there. And then on the 10-year plan, I think the reading of our experts at IFS is that there's lots of ideas in there, and some of them are good, but there's not the kind of how are you going to prioritise these things, how are you going to deliver them? There's not the implementation plan. I think that's where it's not about money at that point. It's about saying you've got all these great ideas. What are you going to do first? How are you going to deliver these things? I think we haven't really seen that yet, and that's what we need, regardless of the budget. We need delivery on that, I think.
Stephen, can I come back to that ambition point that Helen was making there? Do you think the 10-year plan is too ambitious or not ambitious enough?
I'm going to do the such or small portions answer and go, well, the problem is it's kind of both, in that there is a huge amount of ambition in there. And yes, it is true that it did better than any of the other departments, and slightly terrifyingly by the end of the parliament, we as a country will have recreated the Thatcher era situation where, so when she came in, Norman Fowler, as head of the DHSS, had a department that was responsible for half of all government spending because it was health and social security. Well, we've essentially recreated that in the DHSC, except it's just health. But in terms of the scale of the transformation they want and the sort of organising theory about how you get there, there is not a whole lot of ambition or detail there. It does have, I think, one of the problems of this government, which is this idea that things would get better because they would, I don't know, work harder. There would be less. Well, in some ways, it was the problem Rishi Sunak had. It was kind of like, when I'm Prime Minister, I'll cut down on the day drinking in Downing Street and all of the problems will go away. And as we saw then, and we're seeing again now, merely cutting down on the day drinking is a necessary but not sufficient criteria for any of these things to improve.
Let's turn to the net zero mission. Gemma, is the government on track with its plans to achieve net zero?
So far, most of the net zero mission is focused on energy decarbonisation rather than actually getting to net zero. And on the energy decarbonisation, they have changed quite a bit. We've got new emission control structures. They are making progress on that. I mean, their 2030 target, if anything, looks overly ambitious. But I guess where missions you might have thought could be really helpful in driving government change is actually really on the rest of net zero. It's not the energy generation part, where we've already seen successive governments do a lot to decarbonise energy generation in the UK. So that's kind of within DESNZ's remit. The rest of net zero is things where you need to start getting other parts of government and consumers themselves to start making choices, whether it's to shift to heat pumps, to change their food consumption patterns, to change the way we do agriculture in the country. And there's probably less evidence that we've really shifted our ways of working within government or making progress on those more broadly.
Well, that's a question which is, there's a couple of different versions of this question which have already come up through the Slido, asking, and I think this is a question from Victoria. Does the panel see any improvement in how departments or ALBs are pulling together as a result, and not just of the net zero mission, but missions generally? Is there more systems thinking that we can see? Can you say DOS in relation to net zero?
Yeah, in relation to net zero, not so much. I think on the industrial strategy, I think there is evidence of more cross-government working there. That, compared to previous industrial strategy documents, there's much more evidence of thinking about some of those horizontal policy levers, whether it's transport or skills, that have actually been brought together by DBT and the Treasury into that strategy. So I think that there is some evidence of that there. On the other hand, the spending review documents and announcements, probably there was a lot of ambition there to do the spending review differently and for it to be mission driven. I think there's not a huge amount of evidence in that. It's still very much departmental budget allocations, and it's not clear where there are kind of shared objectives across departments, really how that's going to play out. We're still waiting for the performance management framework that goes around that to really understand how much they're working together.
Can I also give you my favourite example of the lack of joined up thinking? And it's a tough contest, but so on the net zero in particular. So, government has this ambition to get to net zero and to move away from internal combustion cars to electric cars. And the OBR recently, set out the cost of moving to net zero. And one of the big costs is the fact that we know that we're going to lose something like 40 billion in fuel duties. We've been saying that for literally my entire career, which is like, best part of 2 decades now. This is not an unknown risk. This is a very known. It's coming down the track. It's been coming down the track a long time. And where is the plan that says, well, this part of government says we're going to move away from this, it's going to crash this tax source? I think it should be embarrassing for this or any politician or any government to not have the answer to, what are you going to do? And the sooner you start, there are lots of options there. You could start taxing electric vehicles. You could start, doing road pricing, because even if we have no, pollution coming out of tailpipes, there's congestion related to driving. But doing that now in a small way and scale, much easier. No, not a plan at all. Just not, no one even thinks it needs to have a plan. It's just remarkable.
Another example of short-termism.
Although there is one example where you sort of could in theory go, oh, this is the mission doing its work, which is the child opportunity mission, where I suspect, though, that is more to do with the political imperatives around welfare spending, meaning that there's a lot of kind of magical thinking around going, is there some way we can reduce child poverty through the education budget, which kind of does produce joined up thinking, but not, I think, in a very policy optimal way, because we're now getting closer and closer as a country to spending the amount of money it would have cost to just lift the 2-child limit, which causes a lot of child poverty, and at the expense of creating a lot of universal obligations around breakfast clubs and best start centres of the kind which successive chancellors have found very hard to get off once they've got on them, even though the policy impact of things like, I know I'm sounding like the Grinch who wants to take away free breakfast, which is in of itself the problem, right? Which is that you do a thing which is, high popularity, fairly low impact in terms of what it does on poverty, and because it superficially costs less to move it from one department's budget to another. I think that's really the only area where you can really see the mission boards leading to the departments working together, but that, to be honest, probably is just as simple as the close political and personal relationship between the respective secretaries of state.
And can I take you back, Stephen, to the net zero question? Nigel Farage and Reform have been making a lot of sort of noise about getting rid of net zero targets, and this government does seem to be quite worried about Reform. Do you think that might end up meaning that this government starts to water down its net zero ambition?
No, I think, partly because the relationship between Keir Starmer and Ed Miliband, which is a central and underrated thing about the importance of the government structures, right? Why was DEC effective in the period of coalition government? Well, it was because it was really important to the Liberal Democrats. Why was DEC effective under the last Labour government? Because of the close political relationship with Gordon Brown and Ed Miliband. I don't think that is going to change anytime soon, not least because as panicked as people in Downing Street often are about Reform voters, there is going to be a large and painful wake-up call about this group of voters. I think they're called people of working age. We shouldn't forget, actually, at the last election, the Labour Party was ahead among everyone who earned a minimum wage and people who earned 150k, because it really, they actually had achieved their dream of being the party of all working people. They're just in denial about it, and also as the working age population has shrunk, it's less and less of an achievement. But there is going to be quite a painful wake-up call electorally about the fact there are costs on the other side of the ledger in May 26, when a bunch of Labour councillors lose their seats in London and Manchester. So no, I don't think then there's going to be a retreat on the net zero stuff.
You wrote a very good column about that this week. Helen, going back to opportunities, what has the government said it's going to do in this space? What is the progress we ought to be identifying, and is it really going to shift the dial, do you think?
Yeah, well, in principle, there's quite a lot going on here. So they have the kind of 4 pillars of this mission. So it spans everything from wanting to increase development in the early years, wanting to increase both attainment and well-being for children in school, wanting to do more about further education, move out of school, and sort of wrapping around that all the kind of like what they're calling family security, all the kind of like other circumstances in young people's lives. So it's kind of a big sprawling mission in some sense, and it's good that you're thinking about all those things in a connected way because people move through this system. But it also means that there's potentially quite a lot to do. Earlier this month, we had the best start in life strategy, and this is one where I think actually relates to what Stephen was saying. If you look at what's in there are some bits in there, but actually the kind of single biggest thing there is a commitment to the previous government's policy of childcare. So it was like 500 million new spending for new stuff on early years. But actually there's 5 billion, so 10 times more, going on to childcare. And actually that's one where maybe the growth mission is dominating, because I think that's more of a pro-growth, get parents into work kind of policy than it is increase the development of young children. So there is some more stuff going on there. One of the things they're doing there is putting money into these kind of family hubs. So the idea of an early integrated service for in the kind of pre-5s. And there's some good evidence about that based on the kind of what we used to have in Sure Start. But again, when I think about the scale of what they're doing now, I think it's something like the total amount of funding on these kind of early years family hub support is still only a third of what kind of Sure Start was getting at its peak. And Sure Start was trying to do kids up to 4, and family hubs are doing up to 19. So I think there is an evidence-based approach here. The government and IFS did a lot of the evidence on Sure Start. There's the kind of the integration of things is good. They're following that model, but this is not a reintroduction of Sure Start. We're a long way from something that looks like that. And the rest of it, I think we have to see what comes next. I think there are some thorny issues coming down the road. Things about universities and further education, but also I think the one that's going to be the big political kind of headache for Labour at some point is the special educational needs and disabilities, where lots of children are are in that situation. It's costing quite a lot of money. Nobody's happy with that situation. It's, including parents, teachers and everybody else. But it's an area where, like many of these areas, you've got to have proper reform, and you've got to find a way to have difficult conversations and do something that's big and bold. And I guess the concern of me and lots of people is that, having just seen the disability U-turns, that's not a great precedent for trying to do things that are difficult but needed.
Yeah, and if you don't do that reform, you just look like the Grinch who's taking something away that people
that's the real
think they had.
danger, right? I mean, we're talking about vulnerable children who obviously do have a need, and it's about how best to support that. But when you've got so many children in this situation, it's not a niche. I don't think it is a niche issue anymore. You have to be thinking about what provision can happen in mainstream schools, how best to support them, how best the money should follow these choldren. And of course that's difficult, because for the parents involved, it's stressful to think about, you've finally got something set up for your child, you know what's happening. Nobody wants to rip that away. But again, we can't just say, well, we'll stick with this because no one's happy because we can't change it. I think you have to find a way to try to move forward in that. Thank you for listening to the IFS Zooms In. If you enjoyed this episode, please do subscribe in your podcast app and share it with anyone you think might be interested. And if you'd like to support our work, you can become a member for as little as £10 a month. Just check the link in the episode description. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time.